Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to episode 11 of the podcast. Today we sit down with Professor Aaron Belkin. He's a political science professor at San Francisco State University, and he's the founding director of the Palm Center, which is a research institute that uses social science in order to inform public policy, specifically around topics like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and also transgender military service. That's just a brief snapshot of all the work that he's done. So please check out the links in our description to learn a lot more about him and a lot more about his bio. And we're just grateful for this conversation. We're appreciative of his work. Today in our conversation, we talk about the origins of the Palm Center and also a lot about the Transgender Military Ban. We hope you enjoy, find it interesting, find it helpful. And so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Welcome back, everyone. And thank you so much, Professor Belkin, for joining us. We are really excited to have this conversation and we really look forward to it. So we're grateful to have you on here today.
Yeah, thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, so we always just like to get started just to have our guests kind of share a little bit about themselves and then maybe how they got into the work that they're currently doing. And we're more than open to whatever you want to share, however far you want to go back, or if you want to just really focus on today's kind of context of your work. Whatever you'd like to share.
Sure. I have 3 jobs. I am a political science professor at San Francisco State, where I teach American politics and also a course on how to design social justice campaigns. And I'm also the director of the Palm Center, and that's a think tank that works on LGBT military inclusion, and we've been running for 22 years now. And then I also run a newer project about 2.5 years old called Take Back the Court, whose mission is to underscore expansion of the Supreme Court as a necessary step for expanding democracy.
Great.
Yeah, you sound like you have to be very busy then, constantly.
Well, I'm mindful that most people who run organizations that are far bigger than mine. And you think about, think about the president, who I guess ultimately is in charge of millions of people when you count service members as part of that. So there are not that many people who report to me, but it is. It's a little bit disorienting to run separate organizations that don't talk to each other. So to have kind of 2 separate strategic plans and 2 separate, accounting books and 2 separate HR policies, and that is, yes, I think many people are busy now, but I think the busyness is fine, but the kind of multiplicity, I would say that, what's the right way to say it? I can't pay attention to one thing, so my focus is kind of split, which I guess is also a pretty common issue.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's a great perspective to have to there's people who are busier than you, so it's nothing to be upset about or complain about. I mean, and I think you're successful in all of these areas because you can just keep the work going, right? And that's you're just doing the best we can do, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
I feel really lucky to have great work to do. I've always felt that way.
Yeah. What went into the start and growth of the Palm Center?
And maybe if you could touch on, I know you did briefly already, but some of the work that specifically you guys have worked on, because I think it's pretty interesting for people to hear about.
So the Palm Center for a little more than a decade worked on getting rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And then we pivoted in 2013, about 2 years after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, to work on the end of the military's transgender ban, which went much quicker than I thought it would. I thought it would take 10 or 15 years, but then President Obama lifted the transgender ban after only about 3 years of advocacy efforts. And then the Palm Center spent the next 4 years defending inclusive policy from President Trump. And now we've been working to get inclusive policy back, which happened just a week into the Biden administration. So that was our easiest win. And I mean, we pursue different strategies at different times, but the basic insight behind the Palm Center's work, and I guess I'll start with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's that you could think of, so Don't Ask, Don't Tell was, from my perspective, very bad, and not only because it harmed the troops and harmed the military, but also because it was dangerous. It was an example of the politics of paranoia, and it was an instance in which the government was going out of its way to fire people on the basis of their identity. So firing people for who they were. And that's very dangerous when you think about it, because in a constitutional system like ours, government can and should punish people for what they do. I mean, if you steal a car, you should be punished. But punishing people on the basis of who they are is a very slippery slope to an authoritarian outcome. And so there's a lot, it's just separate from the question of the well-being of the troops. There was a lot at stake in Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so you think about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it was kind of propped up, you could think of, by two different pillars. And on the one hand was the real reason for discrimination, which was, you could call it homophobia or animus or intolerance or moral disapproval, whatever, dislike of gays, lesbians, and bisexual people. But the generals and admirals who insisted on the need for that policy didn't want to tell the truth about why they wanted the policy put in place. And so instead they made up a phony argument. So you can call that kind of the second pillar, holding up Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was kind of a camouflage for the first pillar. But the second pillar, it was couched in very neutral language of military readiness, nothing to do with judgment or homophobia. And that was the idea that gays and lesbians hurt the military. So it was called the unit cohesion rationale. And the idea of the unit cohesion rationale is that straight people can't trust gay people, and military units depend on trust, which they call unit cohesion. Soldiers and service members have to trust one another with their lives, or else the military can't function. And so if you allow someone into this was, by the way, this was 1993 and 1994 when this debate was taking place, but the argument was that if you allow someone into a unit who utters the words "I am gay," the straight people in that unit won't trust that person, and then unit cohesion would be compromised, and the military's ability to pursue its mission would fall apart. And so, I mean, scholars always knew that set of arguments was bullshit. I mean, the military's own studies at the time showed that it was bullshit. But it's quite different for scholars to know something than for the public and thought leaders to know it. And so the Palm Center's model of social justice was premised on the notion that if you could knock out that second pillar, that idea that gays and lesbians harm the military, kind of knock that over in the court of public opinion, that would open up a space for lobbyists and litigators to push repeal across the line. And our sense was pretty strongly that as long as generals and admirals with a straight face could make the argument that gays and lesbians harm the military, then it would never be safe for a politician to lift Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because if a civilian politician stepped up and said, "I want to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell," the generals and admirals would say, "Well, very sorry, candidate or member of Congress, or, president, whoever it is, but if you do that, you're going to cost American lives." And no politician wants to run on something that the generals and admirals are, say, harming the military. And so our strategy was a research-based strategy, but it was not research to sit on the library shelf. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but the strategy was to use research as the basis of very aggressive media campaigns, and to do so on a repeated basis. And so the idea was that 3 or 4 times a year, and we did this for about 10 years, about 35 times, and it literally worked every time. we would release a new study or new data set or new policy memo, making the exact same point every single time, that it's not gays and lesbians who hurt the military, it's discrimination. And then we would generate national media headlines, and national means New York Times or Washington Post or AP or NPR or CNN, something like that. So it was the same message every single time. It's not gays and lesbians who hurt the military, it's discrimination. And the idea was that by repeating the message in the media, it was like an advertising strategy. That, I mean, if you only saw one commercial in your life for Honda Motors, then when you go to buy a car, you wouldn't buy a Honda. But by exposure to a steady drip of advertising, there's a chance you'll buy a Honda. So the trick in that strategy was that it's very difficult to get reporters to cover scholarship, because if you think about, thousands of studies are released every day, and very few make it into the media. And so, and by definition, we were trying to get into the media with a stale message. We were trying to make our own message stale. But each time you succeed at that, it makes it that much less interesting for journalists to cover you next time around. So the real trick in running the Palm Center was to come up with ever more rarefied ways of getting research into the media. And I also want to say from the outset that we take the research very seriously, and when we find evidence that's contrary to our political views, not only do we publish those data, but we make noise about the data. And I'm very proud that our political opponents have used Palm Center data to make their points. But so the point was never that all the evidence pointed in the same direction. It was just that the preponderance of evidence showed that gays don't hurt the military. And so we pounded away at that idea for a decade. And, there were lots of pretty interesting, I think, examples of how we got that message into the media. But the short bottom line is that fast forward to 2009 and 2010, when former President Obama, went to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, some people on the other side tried to make the unit cohesion argument, but they looked nuts, because everyone knew they were lying out. They were just talking bullshit. So unlike 93, 94, when the generals and admirals were taken seriously when they said gays and lesbians harm the military, in 2009 and 2010, no one took that argument seriously, and that did end up opening up a space for lobbyists and litigators to repeal the policy. Now, we have pursued separate strategies on transgender military, but that's the actually long-winded answer to part of your question. But you also asked how I got into the work, and the answer is that as an undergrad and graduate student, I studied military affairs, and then in grad school came out of the closet, and that was right at the time when President Clinton was losing his effort in 1993 and 1994 to get gays and lesbians in the military. And I was very offended by and concerned with that debate. And I was in graduate school, and I just decided that if and when I ever had the chance to do anything about it, I would try to do that. And so when I was hired for my first academic job, I set up a think tank, which is now called the Palm Center. Didn't know what our model would be at that point, and didn't have any money, but we kind of figured it out, and then just grew a little bit every year.
So how did the process of going from, so like you've got this think tank started and you guys kind of have this mission of what you want to do. It seems like a really cool, interesting strategy. And you even mentioned that you're teaching a class on it at San Francisco State. Like, how did you come to develop that strategy? Because obviously it's worked out very well for you.
Yeah, and I look at our founding documents from 1998, and the first proposals we sent to funders, and they didn't perfectly align with what we ended up doing, but they partially aligned with it. We talked at the outset about using research to inform public policy with data, but I personally didn't know how to get research into the media, and I didn't know about this kind of iterated approach to informing public opinion. And so what happened was, you know, I had I was, you know, I had white privilege and I had class privilege and I had a PhD, so I had all kinds of privilege. But I wasn't at I was at UC Santa Barbara, which, you know, I was very grateful to be there, but it wasn't like Harvard or Yale, where, you know, you'd be taken more seriously by funders and journalists. And I didn't like know billionaires or foundation officers who, in fact, the few foundation officers who knew a little bit from grad school at Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford, I called and asked for help, and they were like, "Yeah, fuck you," politely, but not interested. So the first year of running the Palm Center was really about just cold calling a lot of people who had been part of the conversation about gays and lesbians in the military, and just asking them to serve on an advisory board to legitimate what we were doing, asking them for advice, telling them what we were doing, and then going and trying to find money. And one of the first times that we were able to find money, the person I talked to at the MacArthur Foundation, was it MacArthur or Ford? I don't know, MacArthur or Ford. You know, he was really nice, but he's like, "No, we're not going to help you." And I was like, "Would you just give me a little bit?" And he's like, "No, when we support someone, we go all in." I was like, "Fine." And he was like, "Why don't you try the Haas Foundation, the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund in San Francisco?" And so I reached out to them, and they were like, "Yeah, we're reevaluating our priorities for LGBT." So in fact, it probably wasn't even T at that point. It was probably gay and lesbian. Lots of erasure of bisexuals, by the way, in this whole conversation, but that's a separate thing. Anyways, they said we're reevaluating what we're doing, so come back another time. And then a few months later, a soldier named Barry Winchell was murdered with a baseball bat at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, for being gay. And there was a group that worked on gays and lesbians in the military in Washington that managed to make that story above the fold headlines pretty much every day for a couple of weeks in the New York Times. And towards the end of that media coverage, the former commandant of the Marine Corps published an op-ed in the New York Times saying, "Sorry about this murder. You know, yeah, he was gay and he was beaten to death with a baseball bat, and that's bad. And you know we have this unfair policy, don't ask, don't tell, that's inconsistent with military values, but we're really sorry, but when push comes to shove, gays and lesbians harm the military, and so there's nothing we can do about this policy." And I had a member of my advisory board at that point who'd served in the Clinton White House, and a member of my board who'd served in the Reagan Pentagon. And so this was also my first experience of ghostwriting, but I wrote an op-ed in response to this Marine Corps commandant saying, you know, "You're talking out of your ass. All the evidence shows that gays and lesbians don't harm the military." Super respectful, but just kind of calling him on his bullshit respectfully and based on evidence. And I asked my two board members to sign the op-ed so that it would be bipartisan. And the New York Times published the op-ed. And I had this aha moment, like, oh, wow, like I see how, I mean, that was just one micro realization of many more to come about scholarship in the media. But I could see like a path for getting evidence into the media to inform public policy. And I sent the op-ed to the guy at the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, who had said, "Come back in a year," and he just sent me a check for $7,500, which for us was huge at the time. And so the first year we cobbled together $60,000, and then we just kind of grew at a steady pace. We never became huge. I mean, for a think tank, I think at our biggest, we were probably running at about $1 million a year, which is really nothing. But it was a steady line up from 600,000 to $1 million. There's actually one more story from the founding of the Palm Center. I'd
love to hear it.
I forgot about this. It was pretty funny, but there's just a huge famous hero of the movement named Greta Kammermeyer, and she'd been fired from the military before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and had testified in Congress to try to prevent Congress from putting Don't Ask, Don't Tell in place. Barbara Streisand fell in love with her story and made a movie out of her where Glenn Close played Greta. Greta had spoken at a march in Washington in front of hundreds of thousands of people, just a huge famous person in the military. So, I wanted her on my advisory board because, when you set up an institute and you have no fame or credibility, you want a board of well-known people so that when you go to funders and they're like, well, can I trust you? You say, oh yeah, look at my board. We have famous people on the board. So I found her number and just cold called her and was like, buh, 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 buh. And she cut me off and she's like, tell me what you want or I won't respect you. Um, and I was like, okay, I started this think tank on gays and lesbians in the military, and I want you to hold a fundraiser and be on my board. And she said, fine. It's like, okay. So she lived on Whidbey Island, off the coast of Seattle. So we spent a couple months setting up this fundraiser, and she had a lot of mostly lesbian friends who just like worshiped her. And when she would say, come to a fundraiser, they would come. And so she probably had 50 or 75 lesbians come to her beautiful house on Whidbey Island. And I flew up to Seattle and rented a car and took the ferry out to Whidbey Island and drove to her house and, just wanted to be sure I wasn't late. So I got there like 2 hours early. And Greta has Norwegian heritage. And so she was making a smorgasbord or buffet of Norwegian finger food. And she asked me to stir the potato salad, and I was wearing khakis, and it was like super oily, like salad. And so like I like stir the salad, and this like big splotch of olive oil came like over my crotch, so it looked like I had like peed in my pants. And I was so green at this. I mean, with hindsight, I should have just said, hey Greta, like, do you have an apron or something? And she would have laughed and she would have told her friends, and they would have given more money even, it would have been fine. Like, you're allowed to be vulnerable, you're allowed to make mistakes. But I was so terrified that I got I think it was like the Palm Center's first annual report, and I just like held it over my
carrying it around all night.
crotch. Well, for 2.5 hours. So with my left hand I held the book, the report, and with my right hand was like greeting all these lesbians, and did the whole pitch for money, and they're writing checks, and I'm just taking them with my right hand. And I think after like 3 or 4 hours, finally like everyone left, and it was just like me and Greta and her wife. And she's like, why are you holding that book there? And I was like, oh, I don't know, it's just makes me comfortable. And she's like, okay. And so then like the event was done, and I went back to the rental car, and it was just like, oh my god.
That's so funny.
I told her that story 15 years after the fact, and she
wow.
That is so impressive that you were able to cover that up the entire time.
Totally got away with it.
For all I know, I wasn't doing it at all, and they saw exactly what was going on. But
yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know that we spoke about this once before, but just knowing about the influence that the media has in this whole process is kind of scary, I think. And I guess, like, what was that like to go up against something like that? And like, what kind of perseverance or like grit did you need to get all this research out there?
To go up against the media?
Yeah, or almost to like be with the media so that you can get this information that you want publicized.
Yeah, we ended up using a lot of different kind of strategies and tricks to get research in the media. I mean, I guess the kind of actually it was interesting. Mark Bingham died on September 11th. He stormed that. He was a big, I think 6'2" or 6'3" gay rugby player, and he was on my gay football team at the time. He was a PR consultant, obviously before 9/11 when he died. And I was telling him, like, I've set up this center, and we got to raise money to get advertising about our research. And he's like, don't get advertising, just generate media about your research. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. And he's like, yeah, it's free. Well, it's not free. It's actually unbelievably expensive. But that's when I had my first aha moment about the media. That might have even been before the New York Times op-ed. Actually, who knows? It was about the same time. So a couple things about the media. One is just to realize, if you publish with very, very, very rare exceptions, if you publish a study and it's not covered in the media, it almost like ontologically doesn't exist as far as Washington goes. And so if you want to give your allies a chance to use your research to bolster their argument, you have to get media coverage of it. And you have to get media coverage of it in certain places, like a story. I mean, even in the LA Times probably won't do in terms of getting, being useful to members of Congress. And also, just getting into the New York Times does not mean that the study will have an impact on public policy, but it's all about kind of maximizing the likelihood. So the game is to try to get the research into very high prestige outlets. And this was before social media, so it's a different story now. So that's the first realization. The second realization is that it's hard to get into the media, not just because research is not seen as newsworthy, but also because you have to realize that, especially now with CNN and 24-hour news, like people think that, oh, there's just all this outlet space for news. But actually, the ratio of people and groups and corporations and nonprofits and politicians and, just all kinds of entities that want to get in the news, the ratio of folks who want to get in the news to the available column inches or broadcast minutes every day is huge. And every day there is almost like a game that's played between thousands and thousands of people and corporations and nonprofits that have spent a lot of money on very smart PR firms to get their stories into the news. And only a handful of those folks win every day. So if you are piloting a plane and you crash the plane, like that will get into the news. But for pretty much everything else, unless you're the president of the United States, if there's a headline in the New York Times about you, it's because you figured out a way to make that happen. Like reporters in general don't find you. So there's almost always a story behind why there's a story. Okay, so that's the second thing to know. And then the third kind of thing that, then this was really the learning curve was how to make research newsworthy. And it was about, so just within this kind of third part of the response to your question, there were kind of two kind of poles that had to be you had to steer between them. Because on the one hand, if you want to get coverage of a study that says that the earth is flat, like you're not going to get coverage of that study because that's too outside the mainstream and wacky. At the same time, if you want to get coverage of a study that said the earth is a sphere, that's not going to get coverage because your message is already known. And so you're aiming to, and the point was not to get the coverage for its own sake. It was to get the coverage of a message, the message that gays don't harm the military, discrimination does. But so you had to make that, so that message had to be known enough to get coverage, but not, your kind of frame on that couldn't be so crazy as to turn off a reporter or just seem weird. And so there were different tactics for maximizing the likelihood of getting something into the news. So one thing that was helpful was to try to get a human interest story paired with data. For whatever reason, the American public likes stories and doesn't like data. And so, for example, we did a study showing gays and lesbians in the British military was a success, and pitched that to the London reporter for the New York Times, and she rejected it. But then we found a gay submariner in the Royal Navy who'd been fired for being gay, but then allowed back in. We went back to the London New York Times reporter and said, hey, we have this research, a really good study showing that gays have not harmed the British military. And here's a gay British submariner to tell you that story. And so that became a front page New York Times article. So one, and then there's a whole kind of art and science to kind of finding stories. But that was one thing. A second would be who's authored your study. And so if you could get a general or an admiral to serve as the author of a study, that made it more newsworthy. And the most, I guess, kind of one of the epitomes of that strategy was we did a study so the GAO did a study showing that the cost of firing gays and lesbians is something like $200 million. And we redid their study because I used flawed methodology, and we showed that they were, I forgot, off by 100%. It was like $400 million to fire gays and lesbians over 10 years. But one of the co-authors of our study was William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. So that was the top military official in the United States, saying, so what's the message? It's the exact same message. So in the British military example, it was, gays and lesbians don't hurt the British military, but discrimination did hurt the British military. In the financial study, it's the military is wasting money firing badly needed talent. Another example of how discrimination hurts the military. So in this case, though, it was co-authored by such a distinguished official that made it newsworthy. So the study got on Good Morning America. A third trick was, as you could see, that the gap between the British study and the financial study was to make the same argument, but from a slightly different perspective. So maybe you do a poll of service members, maybe you study a police department, maybe you do a more ethnographic approach where you go into an American military unit and see if gays and lesbians are hurting the unit. So the third kind of trick was to kind of ask the same question from a different angle. And lots more learning along the way. But we always. So I said that our strategy worked pretty much always worked. So about 3 or 4 times a year, 35 times over 10 years, we managed to make national headlines about our research or about our data. But you always had to have a plan B, plan C, plan D, plan E, plan F, because if the New York Times reporter said no, then you had to figure out another way to get coverage. And I can give an example of what like a plan B looked like. By the end of this 10 years, it was getting harder and harder and harder and more expensive to break stories. So one of the last stories we broke about gays and lesbians in the military took 2 years and $100,000 of staff time to break a story on CNN of 104 generals and admirals who were saying that don't ask, don't tell hurts the military. So 104, that's a lot of generals and admirals. Now we're more used to numbers like that because big groups of generals and admirals have started signing stuff. But back in that time, this was one of the first, it might have been the first time such a large group of generals and admirals had said anything, and certainly such a large group had said anything on behalf of gays and lesbians. And that's kind of surprising validators, which, by the way, is another trick for getting media coverage, to get your message covered by people who might not be assumed to agree with you, like getting a sugar company executive to call for, the end of soda to help with diabetes or something like that. So anyways, so 104 generals and admirals, and we took that to the AP reporter in the Pentagon, and they said no. And that's really bad. AP is just very powerful, especially in days of shrinking news budgets, because if you get a story into national AP, there's a good chance that 2, 3, 4, 500 other newspapers, television, and radio stations around the world will pick it up. So it's just a giant amplifier. But they said no, the Pentagon Bureau. Well, AP also has regional offices, but in order to get regional coverage of something, you have to appeal to that region. And so it turned out that the senior officer among these generals and admirals was a 4-star admiral who had been, I think, superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, which so that was Maryland's, kind of Baltimore's region. And so he agreed to be the spokesperson for these 104 generals and admirals. So then we went to the Baltimore reporter of the Baltimore AP and said, hey, would you be interested in this story? And that person said yes, and they took the story, and then it went viral and got onto CNN. So what did it take to get coverage in the media? It took a lot of money. We are a research institute, but we've spent more on communications than on research because it's that important to get media coverage. So it took a lot of money, a lot of privilege, a lot of contingency plans, a lot of relationships with reporters, a lot of luck, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear how you've been able to utilize this philosophy of doing this great research obviously, like you just said, means nothing unless you can like distribute the research for an impact. And it's so interesting to hear how you've like utilized the system that's in place to like really leverage that to like push these like big positive initiatives.
Well, sorry, I know I want to interrupt you. I know you're getting to a question, but this is important. I don't want to forget it.
Please.
You know, scholars are often interested in kind of philosophy of science, ontology, objectivity, truth, subjectivity, social constructions. You know, kind of what is objective, and our point at the Palm Center is that there. And this is, I think, a somewhat interesting tension or contradiction, or maybe a paradox. I don't know, but that there is kind of a truth about gays and lesbians and bisexuals and later trans people, which is that on average they don't hurt the military. But that truth doesn't count as a truth for the sake of Washington policy conversations unless you socially construct that truth in the media. So it was almost like you had to take a social constructivist perspective to positivism and truth, and you know, in an era when facts matter less and less, I think that strategy of just kind of like ramming the truth through the media and through the public opinion, through the national policy conversation, is a very important strategy that hopefully more and more progressive. A lot of groups, every group that has money has a communications team, but the job of that team is usually to get the organization's name in the media. That's important for raising money. It's always, you know, you enhance your power by getting your name in the media, but I think it's much more important to get your message in the media. So to integrate media communications into your social justice strategy, even if you get no credit. I mean, a lot of times the Palm Center got no credit whatsoever for our work because some general or admiral would sign the study, help co-author and then sign the study, and we would just keep our fingerprints off it. Not that we were lying or ashamed of it, but it's just that it was better for the message if someone else was credited for it. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great point. And I think it leads really nicely into my question was you touched on a few times that one of the goals of doing this was, and to get the end change that you were hoping to see, was you had to change public perception. And I'm curious, when you were getting through these phases and you're starting, do you know that it's worked when the policy changes, or is there a point before where you're like, we're there, we made it, and like, this is going to happen?
Well, it's interesting, you know, foundations in the last decade or so, in my experience, have really more and more emphasized, I might even say fetishized, metrics to assess how organizations are doing as they march towards those goals. And I think there are parallel truths about those metrics, which is, on the one hand, yeah, it's important to try as best you can to assess how you're doing. And on the other hand, the metrics are kind of bullshit. And you could say that, you know, maybe if the Palm Center had never existed, then Don't Ask, Don't Tell would have been repealed at exactly the same time in exactly the same way. There's just no way to know that. What I can say is that we had metrics, like, for example, polling continued to change over the course of our work, and the public expressed greater and greater support for gays and lesbians in the military, and service members expressed greater and greater support for gays and lesbians in the military, and generals and admirals did. Now, that was probably overdetermined, and it was partially a reflection of the, for better or worse, the kind of mainstreaming, the politics of respectability of gays and lesbians getting more prominence in the culture in general. But it was also, I would argue, possibly an effect of our work, in part because when folks would try to make the opposing case, once we were up and running, we would just, I mean, always politely, ream them a new asshole. And so it got to because they were spouting lies based on bullshit. Right. And so in fact, I remember very well in like 2002, I think there was a conference at NYU on gays and lesbians in the military. And the organizer of the conference reached out to something like 41 or 42 opponents of gays and lesbians in the military to offer to like pay their way to come to NYU. And not one of them would come to NYU. To, you know, academics will talk about anything. If a free trip to New York, like, sign me up. You want me to talk about paleontology? I don't know shit about it. Like, where's my ticket? But no one would agree to come to the conference from the other side because they knew they were going to get reamed a new asshole. So that's another. And also the media, you could tell in the tenor of coverage, like, that the journalists more and more and more just thought that the other side was just completely full of shit. So that was, and we did a study at one point where we surveyed the editorial boards of small town red state newspapers. So places where George Bush II just killed John Kerry. And very few of those editorial boards were willing to go on record in support of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So all those were metrics that you could kind of measure. But I would say there were also energetic metrics, which, it's just like how things feel, which there's a lot of potential. Well, there's a lot of potential for bias in metrics you can measure, but there's certainly maybe even more potential for metrics, for bias in metrics that are just kind of your gut instinct. But for what it's worth, I would argue that the day we broke the story that gays and lesbians in the military, the day we broke the story that the military was firing Arabic linguists for being gay, was the day that the other side lost the public. I'll come back to that in a second. And then I would argue the day when we published an op-ed in the New York Times by the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying he was wrong about gays and lesbians in the military, and that discrimination hurts the military, not gays and lesbians, that's the day when the other side lost the military. And then I would argue the day when we showed that President Obama could sign an executive order suspending Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that was the day when the other side lost Congress. And so at a very energetic, and I can either say more or not about what those three inflection points, but those certainly felt like big turning points. I mean, I guess I'm going to say more about at least one of the inflection points, even without your prompting. But it took 2 years to get General Shalikashvili to sign that op-ed, to write and sign that op-ed, saying that he was wrong about gays and lesbians in the military, and to get that into the New York Times. It took a lot. We had 4 meetings with him, all kinds of different strategies of working with him. But just a few years before, 97% of generals and admirals were opposed to gays and lesbians in the military. So there were just no officers, even lieutenants, who were willing to go on record in favor of gays and lesbians in the military. Like, not at all in the beginning. And that changed a tiny bit over time. There was a very brave, straight colonel who was a professor at West Point who published an op-ed favoring gays and lesbians in the military along the way. So there were some exceptions, but almost nothing. But after, and we were working the military the whole time. I mean, I was making annual visits to West Point and the Air Force Academy and the war colleges to talk about gays and lesbians in the military and cultivate allies who could make the case internally. But in terms of public statements, once the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I mean, the boss of the whole military, once he said that gays and lesbians do not hurt the military, but discrimination did, it didn't mean that everyone in the military switched on a dime, but that meant that it was safe for our allies in the military to make their case with their peers, and also more and more in public. We would never have been able to get those 104 generals and admirals to sign a statement if it hadn't been for the Shalikashvili op-ed. January 2nd, 2007. So I, if I could choose between, so in response to your, how do you know you're having an impact question, first I would concede maybe we had no impact, but then wearing my hat that says that we did make an impact, if I had to choose between the measurable metrics and the gut feeling and metrics, I would go with the gut feeling metrics. And if I was trying to pitch a donor on giving money to the Palm Center, fuck the objective metrics. I would tell the story of the felt metrics.
Yeah, I love that. And like you're right, because I mean, even just in society in general, you can really feel like the pulse of society change as things are going on. And I love the gut instinct too. I think it tells us way more than we realize, until we really stop and ask ourselves a question of like, I think something's happening here, and I think this is why. So yeah.
I mean, I'll just say, in the end game, a few people made that argument about gays and lesbians harming the military. And by the way, making our argument and winning in the court of public opinion was not sufficient for the repeal. You still had to have lobbyists and litigators and
Right.
grassroots activists. So they were hugely important. So this was just kind of one piece of the advocacy puzzle. But when people made that argument in the end game, I mean, it was bad. It was fucking bad. Like Elaine Donnelly, who's she runs an anti-LGBT military think tank, and she went to Congress and made that argument. And Jon Stewart did a segment on her on the Daily Show. I mean, if I were her, I would have never shown my face in public after that segment, because he just eviscerated her. I mean, not violently, but emotionally violently and politically violently. Bad. Like, so if you'd have to be a fucking fool to like believe what she said after you saw what Jon Stewart did to her. And and during the congressional hearings at the end, the other side was able to find one guy, a retired, what the hell was his name, I can't remember, but a retired Marine Corps general, and he tried to trot out the unit cohesion argument, and there was so little evidence. He's just like grasping at straws. And so the point he made in Senate testimony was, he said, gays and lesbians hurt the military. By the way, the Srebrenica massacre, which at the time was the worst massacre in Europe, since World War II. The reason all those civilians were killed at Srebrenica was that the Dutch military, which was supposed to be guarding the civilians, had gays and lesbians in their forces. And Senator Levin from Michigan, who was the chairman of Senate Armed Services at the time, was presiding over the hearing. He went like this with his glasses, and he looked over his glasses. He's like, "Did you just say what I think? Like, would you like to like rephrase that?" And the general, I think it was like, no. And Levin was like, all right, well, let's take a break. And I mean, immediately the Dutch prime minister, who I think was a right winger at the time, and the Dutch minister of defense released statements, that said like, this dude is like fucking off his rocker and has lost his marbles. Is he fucking kidding? Like, yeah, we failed and we feel terrible about it. We allowed this massacre to happen, but it's not because we had gays in our ranks. Are you fucking insane? So I think we sucked the oxygen out of that argument over the course of 10 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely been like a ton of progress. But thinking about like, there was progress with the Obama administration, and then we see a step back with the Trump administration. And now there's this great victory at the start of the Biden administration. I mean, I guess like, how do you feel like this experience has been, and like what kind of work still needs to be done, or do you continue to do to ensure that these policies are in place?
I was so focused on the second part of your question, I've already forgotten the first part of your question.
I think
Was
it kind of all tied into one. So if you just answer the second part, I think that'd be good.
Well, what the part that I'm tracking was what work remains to be done. But you asked something like, what was it like to get the second victory under Biden, or what did it take to get I just can't remember.
Yeah, it was
just re-ask whatever you want to ask.
Yeah. I guess I'm just like reflecting back on like my knowledge of kind of what's gone on in the past 15 years in terms of policy, and thinking about how we had steps forward and then we had steps back recently, and then recently another step forward.
Yeah.
Like, how do you continue to ensure that these policies stay in place? And then also like, what other work, I guess, do you think needs to be done?
Okay, so on the policies staying in place, Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal has proved to be resilient, and Trump did not go after gays, lesbians, and bisexuals in the military. I think he would have if he could have. But you just could not, with a straight face, make the argument that gays and lesbians were hurting the military. And Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal had 5 years to bake in under Obama, and one thing we did a year after repeal was we released a study based on a year of research showing that there had been no problems in the first year of repeal. And we got a New York Times editorial written about that study, and it just, I mean, I think the debate was going to be framed as a success for inclusive policy, whatever, but we were just trying, we were anticipating that someday someone would probably want to try to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we just wanted to kind of get on record in the New York Times with evidence showing that inclusion was successful. So that has proved resilient. In some, if democracy dies and we end up with an authoritarian government, I mean, there are authoritarian and even fascist gays. So you could get a pro-gay authoritarian government, but in the U.S. context, an authoritarian government would probably go hand in hand with evangelical Christians, who are very anti-LGBT, and so you could see kind of an effort to reinstate Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But the answer on Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the resilience of that policy is a function of it had time to bake in. We've been able to control the narrative. The religious right has been chipping away at LGBT rights, including gays and lesbians in the military, through religious exemptions. Military chaplain shouldn't have to perform a marriage on gay soldiers if they don't agree with homosexuality, and that chaplain never would have been forced to marry a couple they didn't want to marry. But more and more and more, the courts are allowing Americans, including service members, to get a free pass on ignoring civil rights protections for gays and lesbians. So you could see that work being expanded in the military. But for what it's worth, that policy has been resilient so far. On trans, the problem with Obama's repeal of the trans ban is that it took place in the very end of the Obama administration on June 30th, 2016, with just, what was that, August, 4 or 5 months before the election. I thought that was going to be irreversible, because our argument at the time was that once you let toothpaste out of the tube, it's you can't put it back in, and once trans people start coming out and getting medically necessary care and serving openly and successfully, you're not going to be able to reverse that. But Trump, in his shamelessness, did, and Biden just swept into office and undid what Trump undid in a week. And now that policy will have 4 years to bake in at least, and maybe 8 if a Democrat wins the next election, maybe 12 if the Democrats win the next 2. But on the one hand, the other side is, they don't quite organize around LGBT issues like they used to. I mean, they're vicious and they're still anti-LGBT, and they will still, do what they can to fuck us. But it's not quite the same heat that it was in 93, 94. The fight against gays and lesbians in the military was I think at the time, the greatest fundraising bonanza ever for traditional values churches. And when Trump won, there was a statement signed by, I think, 60 or 70 far-right culture warriors, like the head of the Family Research Council, saying, Trump needs to get trans people out of the military. But it didn't become this right-wing grassroots passion project. So some people are saying that to protect the policies long-term, you need to get them out of the realm of regulation and into statute. So pass a statute protecting gays, lesbians, and trans people in the military. I can see the argument for doing that. I think there are also counter arguments for that. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but at least for now, the policies are safe for 4 years and safe-ish moving forward.
Yeah, I'm just so appreciative of the work that you've done and the people that you've worked with have done, because I think that there's just such a power to getting that truth out there, and once it's out there, it's there. And people can still argue against it and not agree with it, but it's present. And I think that there's just a power to that alone. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to reinstate the transgender ban, Trump and Trump's Pentagon had to lie, and they had to lie officially, and they had to lie in a Pentagon report, because you can't just put in place a government policy without justifying it. So former Secretary Mattis signed, I think, a 44-page report where he just lied about trans people in the military. And we took that study down and immediately worked with the American Medical Association and American Psychiatric and American Psychological associations to issue statements of condemnation about the lies they told about the science. We got 6 former U.S. Surgeons General to issue a statement saying that they weren't telling the truth about the evidence. We did a line-by-line refutation of the entire Mattis report and got a New York Times editorial about that. But they still lied, and they got away with reinstituting the policy. Now, if Kavanaugh hadn't replaced Kennedy on the Supreme Court, I'm not sure they would have gotten away with it, because judges were not buying their lies in the lower courts. But once Kavanaugh was seated, so we actually held out on Trump for 2.5 years, and we were really proud. A small group of us of LGBT advocates defended inclusive policy from Trump for 2.5 years, and for a while, I think it was maybe the only area of federal law and policy that was actually better under Trump than under Obama. And the reason was because we had together but we had encouraged the courts to force the military to implement one last piece of inclusive policy that Obama hadn't had time to implement. But then when Kavanaugh was seated on the Supreme Court, the administration leapfrogged the whole litigation process and went to the Supreme Court and said, "We're having a policy emergency. Trans people are posing a great risk to military readiness," and Kavanaugh bought it, and so allowed Trump to put the ban in place.
Great. Yeah. So I wanted to just follow up on the second part of Nick's question. And I'd love to hear more about some of the efforts of the Palm Center now that with everything that happened early in Biden's administration, like we talked about, where's the focus today on the work that's being done?
Well, we spent last year preparing for the possibility of a Democratic president. I think even if the Palm Center hadn't been in existence over the past year, a Democratic president would have come in and repealed the transgender ban pretty quickly. But we pursued 4 or 5 strategies to try to, you can think of them as insurance policies, to maximize the likelihood that that if a Democrat was elected president, that they would quickly restore inclusive policy. So we can, talk about what that looked like or not. And then moving forward, so the VA still does not offer surgery, gender-affirming surgery, to transgender veterans. There are about 134,000 transgender veterans in the U.S. 10,000 veterans in the VA system have gender dysphoria diagnoses, and they can't get surgery. There are folks we're not leading that, but we provide support. And when when folks fighting that fight needed an estimate of the cost of how much surgery would cost, they came to us and we provided that. And the VA was about to offer surgery when they thought Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. And then as soon as Trump won the election, they were like, no, because Trump would reverse the decision. So one thing we'll do is again, support efforts that others are undertaking to get surgery offered to the VA. We need to cancel or withdraw or supersede that Mattis report that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the report that lied about transgender troops. And the problem is that report falsely said, on the basis of no evidence and on the basis of grossly distorted readings of a few studies, that healthcare for trans people is not reliable, safe, and effective, contrary to the global medical consensus that it is. And so the fact that there's a government document issued by the Secretary of Defense that says that is having negative impacts in other settings, like in other agencies are using that at different levels of government have used that report to justify not offering care to trans people, and it's even been cited by a judge. So we want there's really no process that we're aware of for canceling a Defense Department report, but we want a memo issued to, that the report is withdrawn or superseded or something like that. To the extent that there are any implementation issues with inclusive policy, we argue that President Obama's policy for transgender troops was gold standard. We think the Pentagon did an outstanding job of formulating inclusive policy for trans troops, mainly because they followed the gold standard principle of good order and discipline, which is treat everyone the same. So Obama's policy simply treated trans people like everybody else, and that's all that needed to happen. And I think Biden's policy will do that too. That said, no policy is implemented perfectly, so we'll just kind of monitor that situation. There is an issue. So TRICARE is a military health insurance program that includes coverage of family members, dependents, and spouses of service members. And TRICARE is prevented by statute from offering gender-affirming surgery to the family members of troops. Because that statute, it's probably going to be impossible to change that unless the Senate gets rid of the filibuster. But if the filibuster goes, then we'll have a conversation about that. And then there's a much, much longer term conversation to be had about the question of service by people with intersex DSD conditions, and then service by non-binary or genderqueer troops. So we always talked about the lifting of the transgender ban as the transgender ban, but it really was not a transgender ban. Actually, it was a ban on all transgender people, but the inclusive policy that Obama put in place was not inclusive, and that Biden is putting in place, is not inclusive policy for transgender troops. It's inclusive policy for transsexual troops. And what there's not really a ban on non-binary troops, but in a way there is, because if you're a member of the military, you have to be managed as a man or a woman, which means if you're non-binary, you can't be honest about who you are. And so there's a longer term question about changing that policy, but that's what's on our plates.
There's a lot of stuff to still go. I obviously wish you and the Palm Center the best of luck still doing all of that. And if there's any way that we can help with this broadcast and distribution of this to help get the word out even more, I'm happy to be able to provide what little help we can.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. And then we also just like to ask, like, if you were to give like a piece of advice, maybe to someone who's interested in potentially getting into politics or really like working into influencing social policy, like what kind of advice would you give?
My dog is growling because he's scared. Were you scared by that question?
That's a big question.
Well, what kind of person am I giving advice to? Like an advocate or a scholar or someone working in Congress?
I'm going to go broad, and you can answer as broadly as you'd like in response to that. But I would just say, like, let's say a college freshman who's like taking a political science class and knows they see a future for themselves in like the political landscape, but don't really know where they fit, but they just want some good advice on how to navigate the system, and they want to do it ethically, and they want to make good decisions for other people. Like, I don't know, is there any piece of advice or a few pieces of advice that you would give?
I'm really mindful that I've had just a shitload of class privilege and race privilege that allowed me to do my advocacy. So, with most advocates and advocacy organizations, if the organization fails, then people who work for the organization can't put food on their table. And that was never the case with me, because I always had my professor's salary to fall back on. So I had a uniquely safe path that I feel very, very, very grateful for. And so one just kind of very technical piece of advice is, and my artist friends do this, so it's definitely doable, or at least it was before the last few rounds of gentrification, is to be mindful of that dynamic. And so, my friends live in micro studios that they haven't moved from in 25 years to keep their housing costs low, and so that they don't go into debt, because once you start and I think a lot of college students are not really mindful of the crushing weight that debt can have on your career choices after you're done with college. And so just to be mindful about the uh, the importance of having an inexpensive lifestyle unless you have great wealth at your disposal, so that if your advocacy fails, you will not, you'll minimize your suffering. So that's one thing. This next piece of, I don't know if it's of advice, but just like something I think about sometimes, is that it's, of course, it's absolutely imperative for, especially now, for people coming out of college to find a way to uh, make a living. And so there's a certain amount of instrumentalism that goes into career choices for almost everybody. At the same time, um, if there's a chance to work on something that really comes from your heart, that's very sustaining. And I would argue that that having a sense of purpose and mission tied to social justice might feel better than if your sense of purpose and mission is tied to acquiring wealth. Um, Again, you of course have to have a minimal degree of earnings to have housing and food. But in general, actually, there's a literature on this that once you surpass kind of basic needs, that getting more money really doesn't make people happier. But doing work that you care about does. So that's a second thing. A third thing I would talk about would be the power of information interviewing. Um, uh, um, I watched like a lot of LGBT kids. The first organization they'd hear about would be HRC, just because HRC had such a huge advertising budget, and would be, HRC had product placement on like Ellen and Will and Grace, and so they'd come out of the closet at age 19 or whenever it was, and go volunteer for HRC, and then realize like, oh, HRC's, I mean, no, not taking anything away from HRC, but it's a bit corporate, and it's a little bit more LGBT than Q. So it's really not as queer as it is gay, lesbian, bi, and trans, and it's they have tried to work on diversity, but there's a lot of white privilege and whites that's implicated in the social justice models of a lot of organizations, including the Palm Centers. So I want to own that. But it's really useful to, when you're thinking about a path to volunteer or to work, to really interview as many people as you can about what different organizations are doing, because there might be some more radical organizations that don't get media coverage as much, but might more align with your politics, and you want to find out about those. And the only way you can really do that, unless you are a brilliant, well, you can do individual research, but talking to people really, really helps. And just asking like, who's doing cutting edge research and why, or who's doing cutting edge work and why. I think a fourth, I can't remember what number we're on, I think it's a fourth, would be to really try to get some mentorship into how to ask for help. I noticed that many students are too shy to ask for help because they don't feel entitled to it. And many students are overly aggressive about asking for help because they feel too entitled to it. And so the former scenario looks like silence. The latter scenario looks like, a student who just comes in my office without knocking on the door first. There's a literature that shows that people actually liked to be asked for favors, because then, you enter into their kind of ecology and economy, and maybe someday they'll get to ask you for a favor back. But this information interview strategy is an example of, you'll get better information if you learn how to ask for the information interviews effectively, and that is a balance of pestering people without pestering them too much. And the reason for that is, you know, for each 100 people, that's a too big of a number. For each 10 people, you know, let's say you find 10 people randomly on the internet who seem like they're, you know, well-known advocates in the work you want to do, and you want to information interview them. You might reach out to them cold, and maybe only one of them will respond to you. And so the question is how to ask in a way that maximizes the likelihood of response. And one, you know, is to be very mindful of their time, which means a super short email. And the other is to kind of, if they don't answer you, you know, wait a week or two and maybe email them again. Then maybe wait 2 or 3 weeks and email them again. Maybe after doing that 5 or 6 times, you leave a voice message. But so you're not calling every day and asking them for help, to help you, but you're also not letting them get away with ignoring you. And striking that balance, and that's just kind of one example of how to ask for help. But I mean, basically, all I do every day, all day, as director of institutes, is to ask people for help, whether it's donors or advocates or scholars or journalists. And so asking for help is really a skill. Asking for help in a professional way is a skill that to work on. I guess a sixth thing is to be mindful that I don't think there's any such thing as clean advocacy. One of my former colleagues and now friend refers to tempered radicalism, and you know, even in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell work and the trans military work, which, you know, in my mind, we were really fighting for important stakes about what it means to be a citizen, you know, not just the well-being of troops. And so to my mind, those were very important fights and very important wins that helped a lot of people. But they also hurt a lot of people. And I think that that's probably true of every advocacy campaign. In the example of the Palm Center's work, our work is based on a very militarized model. And we had to reinforce the militarization of the culture to make our case. Gays and lesbians help the military. That's a militarized message. And wearing other hats, I worry a lot about the militarization of American society, because I think not of the military as an organization, but civilians, I would argue, in our society are too militarized, and therefore they don't think in critical ways about, you know, whether it's smart to go to war in a certain case or foreign policy choices. So it's important to own that the advocacy work you're going to do is not going to be 100% clean. And then a seventh thing, I guess, I'll probably stop after this.
No, this is great.
This also took a lot of privilege, so I'm not saying this is. I just feel very grateful that I was able to do what I'm about to say, which is, these are marathons; they're not sprints. And in the context of social justice, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and of the trans ban happened very quickly, but they were still multi-year fights. 17 years total on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and I mean, I was involved in the trans military campaign. For all intents and purposes, was 3 intense years. Although there had been a few people talking about the issue and trying to fight for decades. But the point is, even in the short versions, you need to, you know, self-care and be a little playful. And you know, part of the reason that I had privilege and was able to do that was because there were not life or death stakes for me. And so, you know, it's quite a different thing to ask a Black activist to be playful about Black Lives Matter when there are police officers executing Black civilians. So I get that. I get that, you know, the playfulness that we could bring to our advocacy from time to time was a reflection of a lot of race and class privilege. And it was helpful when we could do it. One of my favorite, this still makes me chuckle. I don't even know if people say chuckle, but back in the Bush days, he had just a shit for brain Secretary of Defense named Donald Rumsfeld. That administration lied. The Republicans have been lying for so long. Like, Trump is not new. Their lies were about Iraq, and they took us to war on the basis of lies. Um, Anyways, so we're making the case about gays in the military, and Rumsfeld, some journalist busted Rumsfeld for creating this office in the Pentagon whose job was to plant fake newspaper stories in Middle Eastern newspapers to, pontificate about the wonderfulness of the American military in Middle Eastern newspapers and the wonderfulness of America. And it was embarrassing for Rumsfeld, and he immediately that day got rid of that office. I'm sure he parked the work in some other place in the Pentagon. But anyways, optically, he got rid of that office, and he released this quote that said, "The Pentagon would never lie." And so, our whole case was predicated on the notion that the Pentagon was lying systematically about gays and lesbians time and time again. And so we compiled a press release of different lies that the Pentagon tells at different times, and issued this press release that's still posted on our website. And I think the headline was something like, "Pentagon claim not to lie is seen to be untrue." And Rumsfeld had a senior, like an executive assistant at the time, or a strategist. I don't know, someone very senior in his office, who was a gay Republican, who I'd never met, but he called me out of the blue and just like screamed at me, and for that one. And I guess, I don't know, maybe he was just humiliated because he's gay and here was a gay group that was humiliating his boss or whatever. But I really like that one. So a little playfulness time to time goes a long way. Actually, I will say one more thing. No, that's enough. 7 points is enough.
No, please.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't know if this is really something that's necessary to worry about at like the beginning of one's career, but I will say, in my work, not on the Supreme Court actually, and actually not on transgender military, but on gays and lesbians in the military, on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, by far, the worst acid drips, sleepless nights, nightmares, difficult times, fights, was not with the Christian right or with the military, but it was with other LGBT groups. Actually, on trans military too, now that I think about that. There was always a degree of collaboration, and the collaboration was always important, but allies did not always behave well. And that was super, super painful. And
Was
so,
that people saying things like you're not advocating for us the way we want you to, or how did that play out?
oh, no. That's you. Well, you remember that study I told you about? The Pentagon spending firing gays and lesbian troops is 100% higher than the GAO claimed, and we lined up this huge commission to do the study and to sign it, including a former Secretary of Defense. Cost a lot of money, took a lot of time. If you're breaking a story in the newspaper on the basis of a study, you almost always have to give the reporter an exclusive on that story, because that's one of the few things, like it's kind of an arrow in your quiver that journalists don't like to be scooped, and so if you give them an exclusive, that means they get to report on your thing first. And studies are so not newsworthy that if the reporter doesn't have an exclusive, they'll just not do the story. And so, as a courtesy to our main partner group working on gays and lesbians in the military, we gave them the finding from our study before we took it. Well, after we'd taken it to the Washington Post, we just told them, hey, there's going to be a Washington Post article about the main finding in the study, which is the cost of firing gays and lesbians is X amount of dollars. And they proceeded to release that number in public, which, thankfully the Washington Post still went ahead with its story. But just shit like that.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. I think that's what we're really trying to do in general, just with our conversations, is that like there's so much there as you reflect back on the work that you've done and the experiences that you've had, and you just telling us about that, some of like your favorite takeaways and some of your key like pieces of advice, I think is so helpful. And just the work you're doing in general is so helpful. So yeah, thanks for sharing all of that.
You're very welcome. I thought we were going to talk about the Supreme Court more than gays and lesbians in the military, and this ended up being all LGBT military and no courts. So there's that.
Yeah. Well, it's great. And I think that, we like to let the conversation flow wherever it goes naturally. And I think it was a great conversation. And again, thank you for sharing. I think, really as I like reflect on all the work that you've done and I think about it, and I know you mentioned that there's other people who have to be assigned credit at certain times because it's just more impactful when it's coming from somebody. I think you guys have been, I love the saying, a rising tide lifts all ships. And I think you guys have been a great tide in that metaphor to lift a bunch of ships in a bunch of different areas. So I think the work you're doing is great. And I, wish you guys all the best as you guys continue to do more stuff.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciated this conversation, and we're grateful just to be able to really share this information and put this message out as well.